Hello, welcome back. We're on to our final session of the day. Final session! How did we get here so quickly? It just goes to show when we're speaking about things that we're passionate about, speaking about things that we love, this is where it needs to be. And I'm very, very glad that you have been engaging. You've been chatting in the chat box. Do not stop now. There are so many more things that we want to get from you and learn from you, because a lot of you have your ear on the ground, and that's very much about what our next session is about. It's about community. It's about listening to those who live in the communities day in, day out, what they need, and sometimes the things they need that are not in their power. How can you help? Well, we're joined by Cormac Russell, the Managing Director of Nurture Development, and we're taking on from Leigh from Sport England and Jodie from Doncaster Council. And they're here to discuss about those things, about how we're best placed to make those changes, and of course what must be done to reduce the inequalities. So Cormac, I'm going to hand straight over to you, and you're going to take us through this final session of the day.
Sorry, it's actually myself, Warren Leigh from Sport England. I'm going to do the introductions and just kind of set the scene for the session, and then hand over to Cormac and Jodie, who will do the presentation. So, hello everybody, and welcome to this session on Nothing About Them Without Them. We're going to outline how it is that local people are best placed to know what they have, what they need, and what must change to reduce inequalities. Whether this is your first session of the day, or if you've been enjoying the conference from early this morning, hope you're all well, and looking forward to what I know will be a really interesting conclusion to day one. So, as I said, my name is Warren Leigh. I'm a strategic lead at Sport England, and I'm your host for the next hour. And one of my main responsibilities in Sport England, and the primary reason that I'm here today, is through my involvement in the Sport England Local Delivery Pilot Programme. And very, very quickly, just for those that are not aware, there are 12 local delivery pilots. We often call them LDPs, who we've been working alongside since December 2017. As this is a London sport conference, you may be interested to know there are 2 pilots in London. There's one focused in Southall, and there's one in an area of Hackney. And they're the 2 pilots that I work closely alongside. But you'll also get the opportunity to hear today from another of our local delivery pilots, from Jodie Bridger, who works on the Doncaster pilot, Get Doncaster Moving, who I'll introduce later in the session. And just very quickly, the relevance of the pilots to the session today is that within them there was a commitment from the outset that Sport England would use these to do things differently. So as well as being a longer term approach to funding, it was also about us being much less prescriptive in how we use that funding. And right from the beginning, one of those key principles was to avoid a set of top-down, narrow set of criteria that dictated what local places should focus on and how it should be used, but instead tried to work more collaboratively with partners and communities and people in those places. And that meant understanding what strengths existed already, what their requirements were, and what was important to those people locally. Now, each took a different approach to this, and you can find out about more all 12 via both the Sport England website and also a recent publication we've produced about the LDPs called People and Places, the Story of Doing It Differently. I'm sure we can pop a link to that in the chat at some stage today. So that's about the local delivery pilots and why this is relevant to them. But that's probably enough from me in terms of way of introduction. The format for this session is that you're going to hear presentations from 2 speakers, which will take us to around 3:30 p.m, possibly slightly over. And then we've got plenty of time for a Q&A session if you've still got the energy left at this stage of the conference today. Please do put your questions in the chat as the presenters are speaking, but we will pick them up when we get to when both have finished or once they've concluded. But if they come to mind as they're speaking, do pop them in the chat and we'll pick them up there. So that's enough by way of introductions. So I'm going to hand over now to our first speaker today, which is Cormac Russell, Managing Director and founder of Nurture Development Limited, who's literally wrote the book on asset-based community development, I think several books potentially, and has been supporting community-based approaches across the globe for many years, and has also provided support to some of the local delivery pilots. So Cormac, it's over to you.
Warren, thank you so much, and welcome everybody. It's great to be with you here today. So in the next 10 or so minutes, I just wanted to share some thoughts really, and help the conversation going. I think Jodie is also going to be sharing her own experiences in applying, I suppose, what is a community-centered approach. So a couple of quick thoughts, and then I'll hand over to Jodie for some practical application in the UK context, and particularly in her work in Doncaster. So the first thing I wanted to say is I think because we're talking about community-centered ways of thinking about sport, there's two images that I have in mind. The first you see here is a swimming pool, and hopefully you can make out that it's a 3-lane swimming pool. So I think a useful way of thinking about communities that we serve and we're alongside is to think about in the first lane that there's a whole range of things that communities do by themselves. And they're often doing without thinking, I'm doing this to be healthy or I'm doing this to move more. They're doing it because they care about it. So in a sense, they're doing what they care about enough to act upon. And a lot of that stuff in the first lane is invisible. We can't see it, or we don't value it, or maybe it doesn't fit within our categories in the sense of how we understand sport or well-being or whatever it might be. So that's a really important lane, I think, to move in discovery mode around rather than delivery of services. The second lane is where there are a whole range of things that communities can do with the smallest amount of light touch help. So it's not actually about doing things for the community or to the community, but being alongside and doing with the community. So the first lane, it's by the community. They're doing it on their own. The second, they're doing it pretty much themselves with a little help. And the final lane is where the community is doing stuff that is actually, I suppose, largely being supported by institutions. So the outside world, the outside institutions are doing things for the community. So by the community, with the community, and for the community. It's just a simple kind of metaphor, sporting metaphor, to think about that 3 lanes of the swimming pool. A lot of our challenge is not getting stuck if we're outside agencies getting stuck in the 3rd lane. That's the trick. And I think an awful lot of outside institutions are stuck thinking about what can we do to get communities to move more, to help them to be well. It's a kind of a fixing model, a deficit model that says there's something wrong with the community and they need outsiders to come in and do something to get them fixed or get them working better. And I'd suggest we actually shift that mindset and recognize we can't know what the communities need from outside until the communities know what they have themselves in that 1st and 2nd lane. So that's the first sporting metaphor. The second one that I wanted to share with you is a football metaphor. I think an awful lot of communities are like soccer matches where you've got 22 people doing the hard work, probably 22 people who least need the exercise, while you've got 30,000 people watching on as spectators, shouting at them, telling them what they should do. And a big part of what we're trying to do in building community is change that narrative so everybody feels that they can participate and they can get involved. I think that's going to happen not by trying to get communities, who are watching the football match to learn to play football, but by finding out what it is that people who are watching the football match really care about themselves and that they care about enough to act upon. So I think that's the key question. What do people care about enough to act upon? I think one of the reasons we see so much polarization in society is because we're asking far too many people what their opinions are. I have nothing against finding out what people's opinions are, but often what people tell us when we ask them what their opinions are is what they think we should do to or for them. And I think a more interesting conversation is what do you care about enough to act upon with your neighbours, and how can we support you to do that? So that's the critical, distinctive piece around asset-based community development. It changes the nature of the conversation and makes it less about services and programs and more about a good life. People don't want a service, they want a life. And a good life is about having enough, I think, things to do that are meaningful, that you're directing with people that are close at hand. So next slide. One of the reasons I think we struggle to actually get to the heart of starting with what's strong instead of what's wrong is that so often as outside actors trying to be helpful, we're taking a medical model approach to how we work with communities. So what we tend to see is what we think is wrong, like in this picture here, where you have two clinical psychologists who only see the symptom of the koala and think the koala has a mental health problem. What they fail to see is deforestation and the fact that the koala is having a really healthy response to a sick environment. And I think one of the opportunities for Sports England and for the local development partnerships and, for sport generally is for it to see itself through the lens of being an asset to community building and actually seeing the wider scope of possibility. Because for me, I think when we see the neighborhood as the primary unit of change, not just the individual or the institution, we really begin to see the kind of wider environmental possibilities here. So part of the challenge in asset-based community development is shifting our unit of change from the individual or the institution or program to seeing a neighborhood as a primary unit of change and all of the possibilities that that brings with it. Next slide. This is about moving beyond service land and thinking, that what we're actually doing is servicing people who have somehow got a sports deficit or a programmatic deficit, and instead beginning to see that this is bigger than self-help or professional help. This is really about community cohesion and about rekindling democracy. You see, I think sport, when we go right back to its origins, was an expression of democratic, strong communities, growing their culture, growing their passion. And when you think about it, so many groups in societies all around the world are involved in activities of all kinds of different diverse expressions. They're finding ways to move together, to dance together, to sing together, to compete with each other, and to cooperate with each other, all of which loosely you might call sport. But that idea of finding a way of creating social movements that build social justice, that include more people and that are fun. So it's not our cross to bear, it's a joy to do it. Takes us beyond help in that old kind of tired charity sense model and brings us into something that's much more about catalyzing community from the ground up. You see, I think instead of bringing sport to the community, we're joining sport in the community. And I think that kind of mindset gives us the opportunity to be alongside communities rather than to be the cavalry riding in and saving the day. Next slide. And a lot of that is about recognizing, actually, we're not just talking about sport. We're talking about, in the widest sense, activities, movements, things that people care about. And it may not always be the case that when we're doing the community work, that it's always just sport related. Sometimes it's worthwhile actually just finding out what the associations, all of those ways that people circle up are in the community, and then spending time figuring out with them how they'd like to move more. And the sport emerges from that rather than some kind of a prescriptive way of working. Next slide. I think one of the challenges we have really got to face, particularly in terms of inclusion, is the challenge of lifting labels off of people and really beginning to see, like in this illustration that you see here, that Sam can be known as the person who's moving around the community in a wheelchair. But it's also important to see Sam as somebody who's contributing in his neighborhood, moving around and participating in whatever way he needs to participate, but also contributing gifts. And this is a key point. I think the mindset that says in every single community, with every single person, people are contributing gifts. And the challenge that's before us is to reveal those gifts and then to figure out ways that those gifts can be received reciprocally in communities, so that on the days that Sam doesn't show up, he's missed. He's not known by some label, he's known by his gifts, and he's supported to participate in society, in community. That's the critical piece. Next slide. So just the final two slides and final two thoughts. I think it's really important we think about power here. It's very, very easy when we've got a big program like the programs that we're dealing with, that we start engaging with communities as if they're just passive recipients of our programs, and that, the whole focus is on getting sporting organizations to apply for grants so that they can do the programs. that they think are going to best serve their community. But I think it's really important that we shift the narrative away from thinking about people as victims, as passive recipients, or even as advisors of programs, and that we start the narrative, the conversation, with this idea that we see citizens in communities as producers of a better tomorrow. Really, the flow, the flourishing, the power, if you like, to move towards a preferred future is within the community itself. And we're hatching that from inside out, not from outside in. So treating people as producers, as needed, not needy, is a really important mindset. Doesn't mean that people don't have needs. They do. Everybody does. But if we can start from the premise that by seeing what people have, and then supporting them to use what they have to get what they want, it's much more likely that we'll understand what their needs are. Because in the final analysis, you can't really know what people need until you first know what the communities themselves have. So the final slide. And that brings us to the final thought. That's why I believe it's really important to start your focus on what's strong, not what's wrong, and then use what's strong to address what's wrong and make it stronger. Make the strength that's in the community even stronger still. And I think the best way to do that is from the edge in, is to actually begin the process of looking at those who society have defined as the problem and give them the power to redefine the problem. And in doing that, we'll all move more fairly into hopefully a flourishing future. I'll stop there. Thanks, Warren. I think, is it Jodie next, or do I hand back to Warren? I'm not sure of the sequence. Warren, is it?
Yeah, it's just myself quickly first, Cormac. But yeah, just to say thank you for that. Really interesting and thought-provoking. Please do put questions in the chat that we can then pick up in 15 minutes if you've got any reflections on that. And for the second speaker, just to introduce Jodie, as I mentioned in my introduction, the local delivery pilots all have a strong focus on communities in their work, and Cormac certainly worked with a few of those pilots, including Doncaster. But I'm really pleased to welcome the second speaker today, which is Jodie Bridger. Jodie's the local delivery pilot program manager for Get Moving Doncaster, which is the Doncaster local delivery pilot. So Jodie, if I can welcome you to the virtual stage, and it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Warren. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to London Sport for inviting us to share our story. So, nothing about them without them, or as some Yorkshire folk might say, not about them without them, has been guiding our work in Doncaster for some time now. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I'll share our journey with some examples of how our community-centred approach is connecting and influencing change in the system. But before I do that, there's some things I want to share with you before we start, a couple of caveats. So this is Doncaster's journey. It's the way we've tried it. It's not the only way, and nor am I saying it's necessarily the right way. Much of our approach has evolved iteratively to respond to our context, the learning we've had along our journey, and our local circumstances. And despite as things might appear in the presentation, not everything has been a linear sequence of events. In reality, it's been much more messy than what it might appear. And the illustrations that you'll see throughout the presentation have been gathered by our creative illustrators over the last 3 to 4 years throughout different events and meetings. So these haven't just been drawn in the last week or so in preparation for this. These are real life drawings that have happened with conversations with communities and across our huge network of partners in Doncaster. Next slide, please. So this is Doncaster. We are a metropolitan borough in South Yorkshire, and we are the largest borough in England by geographical area. And we've got a population of just over 310,000 people. For those of you that don't know, we've got a fairly large market town centre, a number of surrounding suburbs, villages and towns that are geographically disparate, and they all have their own unique identities. There are stark differences across and within our communities in their infrastructure, cultures, and of course in their behaviours relating to physical activity. Our local challenge is framed by high levels of inactivity, low levels of participation, and high levels of deprivation. And the areas that you can see highlighted in red are the places in our borough that are most affected by health inequalities. And we know through a piece of research that the Behavioural Science Consortium did with us that in these areas, adult inactivity can be up to 60% compared to the borough's average of 30%. Next slide, please. When people ask us, where did your journey start? It's so difficult to pinpoint a moment in time, but I'll not go any further back than 2015, but in 2015, the public health team in Doncaster had started to explore how asset-based community development approaches could shape a more effective health and care services in Doncaster. This soon accelerated when Denby Main, a small village on the outskirts of the borough, became one of 10 pilots involved in a national programme known as Well North at the time. So this approach, and I believe Cormac, I think, was one of the first people involved in supporting Doncaster in our journey, started to challenge traditional ideas of health improvement by working with communities. And it put a focus on improving health by being part of a vibrant and connected community rather than a deficit model of tackling specific health issues in isolation. In 2016, Doncaster hosted a stage finish of the Tour de Yorkshire, which at the time was one of the biggest major sporting events to take place in our borough in recent history, if you forget about the St Leger horse race in September. The race passed through our towns and villages, and it captured the imagination of residents, communities, and our senior leaders all in one day, all in a couple of hours, about the difference that sport and activity can make to people's lives. We'd not seen community spirit like this in Doncaster for some time, for some years. Next slide, please. So this then rolled into 2017, and physical activity in sport was recognised in the development of Team Doncaster's borough strategy, which was framed around tackling inequalities and inclusive growth. Physical activity in sport was included as one of 9 transformational themes or contributing factors to our ambitions, and specifically the 4 outcomes of learning, working, living and caring that you can see on screen. So this means that physical activity in sport, for the first time ever in Doncaster, was considered equally as important as other transformational work, such as improving educational attainment and our local place plan. Next slide, please. So in 2018, and this is the last of our sequence of events, the newly formed Get Doncaster Moving Partnership launched our 10-year strategy with the vision of healthy and vibrant communities through physical activity and sport. The partnership placed community at the heart of our ambitions, and we had a collective focus on tackling inequalities by creating the right conditions for people to form active habits and routines. Next slide, please. So at the time, our vision felt very different to our previous approaches. We recognised that being active is about much more than physical well-being. So we asked ourselves 2 questions. Well, if we want a healthy environment community, how do we build that? And if we want to tackle inactivity or use activity to support that, how do we tackle inactivity in Doncaster? Next slide, please. So each of the LDPs has had very different starting points, but there are some commonalities in terms of how the pilots have accelerated their journey. In Doncaster, we've explored the role of partnerships and the values that are really important to us working together collectively. We've had support of senior leadership across our partnership that's given us top cover and space to have a go at working differently. And we've started to change the way we've thought about our ambitions, and there was a realisation that we needed to approach it in a different way. It's essentially putting people at the heart of change at all layers of the system. We've also taken a long, hard look at the data and insight and evidence that we already had at our disposal. But also this helps us to understand what we don't yet know. What do we need to find out? In addition to this, you might have heard about various models of systems mapping and different techniques. So we undertook one of those processes in Doncaster with Dr. Nick Cavell and Harry Rutter have done some work with the World Health Organization, but it wasn't necessarily about the map that we produced. It was all about the process and who was involved. This helped us to understand more about what's happening in our place that has a positive and negative influence on our population's activity behaviours, understanding who's involved and how it all connects. This did give us a borough-wide level view, but we still didn't have a deep understanding across our very different communities about what was happening. We needed to open our eyes and ears to people and their lives and understanding, what people get up to day. What does life feel like in our different communities across Doncaster? So we started our insight work with 3 phases, which involved door-to-door surveys, supporting resident-to-resident conversations, and a number of community workshops and events to encourage and support residents, stakeholders, anyone involved in community work to come and talk to each other in Doncaster. We recognised that we needed to invest in our communities alongside what was going on already. So I mentioned the Well Doncaster approach in 2015. We used the principles and learning to understand how we can shape our thinking around our community-centred approaches to physical activity. And we actually developed a formal collaboration with the Well Doncaster team, which has given us shared capacity to build trust in communities with the people, groups and organisations who can truly make a difference. And finally, on this slide, the strategy afforded us time in theory. A 10-year strategy gives us time, but we soon learned that the practicalities of how we wanted to work would take much longer than 4 or even 10 years. So we had a genuine commitment across our partnership to work in this way for the long-term approach. Next slide, please. So the 12 pilots have prioritised capacity in their places to understand the lived experience in each of our places. Well Doncaster supports the development across a broad portfolio of areas such as literacy, volunteering, access to services where residents need those, the environment, healthcare, housing, debt. The approach is influenced, I suppose, by the wider determinants of health at individual, community and organisational level. In the last 6 years of Well Doncaster, has evolved and accelerated the evidence base across a greater number of communities in Doncaster, and it's now embedded in our Team Doncaster localities model for community-based working. So last year, for those of you who aren't aware, Public Health England's community-centred approaches report has further added to how we work in Doncaster, and we're really using the advice, guidance in that report to shape where we go next in terms of how we work. So I'd absolutely encourage anyone on this call to take some time out and have a read of the public health recommendations around community-centred approaches, which will give you much more of an idea around how we can shape at individual, community and an organisational level. Next slide, please. So the backbone of our approach is based around we've used a 4-stage priest inquiry process that we do this every year. Each time we do it, we build on existing insight and the assets and the people we've been working with over the last 6 years. But we also bring in new people, groups and organisations along the journey. So the process was developed by David Cooper-Ryder in the 1980s and is designed to support change by focusing on doing more of what's already working rather than looking at the problems and trying to fix them. And I won't talk about the stages too much, but for us, the discovery phase is very much about engaging with residents to find out what's working well. And that's quite a large, extensive piece of work where we support residents to have these conversations. So we ask questions such as, what are the strengths and successes in your area? What's contributed to these? What was happening at the time? Who was there and what was their role? The following 2 phases are very much focused around event activities. So the dream phase, residents community organisations are invited to community events to discuss what ideas they have for their community and how they'll meet the priorities that we've found out in the discovery phase. The design phase is very much more practical. It's rolling up the sleeves and understanding what actions we need to take together collectively around some of these ideas that the community wants to achieve. And that's very much working out who's got some gifts to share, where do what role people can play in terms of developing actions and plans for their communities. And the final phase is the delivery stage. So this happens in different ways in different communities, depending on the energy, the momentum, and the number of people and resources that community has at the time that show through the different stages of the process. Next slide, please. So the approach to inquiry is supported by the Well Doncaster team, and our Director of Public Health often calls them the lightning rod to support some of this local action. So the process has provided the evidence and insight to inform individual community plans, as I mentioned, but also community insight profiles, which the Well Doncaster team use to influence decision making and ways of working at an organisational level. The team has supported residents who want to lead change. So some of the actions that might throw up around identifying training and development opportunities, and they often support residents to undertake various different roles linked to the plan, such as exploring, reporting and championing various activity. And one of the things the team are very passionate about and currently testing at the moment is alternative ways of funding. So it's easier to make it easy and accessible for communities to lead the change, because often, as many people will know, that many funding opportunities get tied up in lots of governance and red tape, and actually want to make these funding opportunities really accessible for people to make change. So we're exploring microgrants and other participatory budgeting, such as a Dragon's Den style event, where community groups come and pitch their ideas to residents, who then vote on the best idea for the priorities in their community. Next slide, please. So while the LDPs have resource and capacity to accelerate change, one of the common findings across all our work so far is that it's the small steps that have had the most significant change in our places. So this is Julian. Julian set up the Yorkshire Bike Shack CIC in January this year. He's really passionate about helping more people to access bikes and cycling opportunities, so set up a business to refurbish bikes and distribute them to those in most need of support. So Julian first got in touch with the Well Doncaster team in March this year because he's having difficulty finding a suitable venue to provide the services. James, our officer in Bentley, knew of a local new local places and spaces who could offer help, and soon connected Julian to find a temporary home, a place called Bentley Urban Farm, where you wouldn't usually expect to find a bike shop. Keen to find out more about how he could support his new community, Julian got involved in the appreciative inquiry process, which has helped him to connect, share ideas, skills and resources in the community. And soon after the inquiry process, Julian partnered with a local community group who we met through the process to provide bikes and training sessions for the group of people this organisation supported. On a borough-wide scale, Well Doncaster facilitates a collaborative space with the voluntary community sector where Julian was introduced to a new organisation called Flourish Enterprises, who specialise in community care and support. And Flourish and the Bike Shack have very similar aims at their core, and subsequently collaborated to access investment by the Well Doncaster Dragon's Den funding initiative that I explained earlier. In addition to this, the team are members of the Active Travel Alliance in Doncaster, where they connect the community plans and community priorities around walking and cycling to help guide planning and delivery of new and developing active travel schemes. Julian's now a member of the providers group of the Active Travel Alliance, where he continues to influence and connect with a broader network of partners across the whole of the borough. And the images you can see on screen are of Julian, featured in our most recent active travel campaign. We launched this story last week, and over the weekend we've had several responses on social media from people across Doncaster who want to donate and volunteer and get involved in Julian's group. And the reason I share Julian's story is because that just kind of started with a one-off phone call back in March this year, and we're now in September, and I suppose the impact that Julian's been able to have on his community and also borough-wide to support residents in just 6 months has been absolutely incredible. And we're very proud of how Julian's been able to offer his gifts to Doncaster and the residents to support more people who need it. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide. And you can see the coloured circles in the diagram on the left-hand side, which show a number of our learning themes that have been driven by local voices and came through our systems mapping. So these are some of the themes and areas of work that we are prioritising and focusing on in Doncaster. We're using our community-centred approaches to ensure that residents lead exactly how those priorities are delivered. But doing this alone is not enough. So the diagram you can see on the right-hand side demonstrates where we really, truly want to be to make change. So rather than delivering those circles in isolation from each other, the next phase of our work is understanding how, through Well Doncaster and through our community-centred approach, we can really connect those themes of work in our neighbourhood and communities, driven by the community voice and the support of our team and communities. Next slide, please. And finally, I would just like to say thank you again to London Sport and Warren for facilitating this session. And you can also see some further information and direction to our website, where we've got lots of reports, etc., on our insight and our processes that can give you much more detail than what I've been able to share with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jodie, and thank you, Cormac. Hopefully for the audience watching, that was a really good mixture of the kind of the key principles around asset-based community development and this community-led approach, and then some real practical examples of how Doncaster colleagues in Doncaster have interpreted that and brought that into their work. A couple of quick reflections from me, and then if I can start with a question and hopefully encourage colleagues who are watching to pile in with some more into the Slido link that you have. Yeah, well, Cormac, I was really interested. I've never really thought before that the multi-billion-pound football teams that I watch every weekend started off as local community, often work-based or education-based or community-based clubs in a field. And now, yeah, they're watched by kind of billions across the globe. So, yeah, just showing what, 100 years plus of development and what can happen there. And Jodie, through some of your work, really interested in, first of all, the sobering statistics around 60% of inactive people in some of those places that you're working in versus kind of an average across Doncaster of 30%. And so just the need to understand how to get deep into those communities and understand what it will be that makes that change for them to become more active. So my first actual question, and this is to both of you really, and I think, Jodie, it doesn't have to be you first, but I guess it links to Julian's story. And how do you identify those people, those community groups, those community organisations, those strengths that you mentioned, Cormac, within a place that can really be the catalyst for some of this work? Do they exist in every single place? And people lead busy lives, so do you believe they exist everywhere? And if so, how do you tap into them, and how do you get them excited and get them involved in this work and get them driving it forward? So Cormac, maybe because Jodie's just finished, if I come to you first there, and then Jodie might have some thoughts on the back of your initial response.
Sure. Thanks, Warren. Well, look, we're doing a big shout out to Essex, who've invested heavily across the whole county in this way of working. And the learning there and in other places is if you actually go in at local community level and you're prepared to invest in having one-on-one conversations and talking with all of the associations and the informal networks in a place, you very quickly begin to discover that every single community, without exception, has assets in the sense of people have knowledge, they have skills, they have talents, they have interests, they have passions. And also within that, the clubs and the groups themselves have achievement stories and desires going forward. So I think a big part of the work that we're talking about here is supporting people who are not connected to get connected with their neighbours and then to figure out together what they want to do. And that isn't always, in my view, about starting the conversation around sport or around physical inactivity. It's about starting with what people care about themselves. That's the critical thing. If you can start there, you will discover that people have all kinds of interests and motivations to act. I think where we go wrong a lot of the time is when we start setting the agenda top down. And then we'll use terms like hard to reach, which is a really problematic term. Seldom heard might be a better way of putting it, not hard to reach. But when you actually get alongside people properly, of course, there's an abundance of energy and enthusiasm in communities. It's just a matter of supporting that to connect and mobilize.
Thanks, Cormac. And Jodie, I don't know if you have any reflections. Obviously, you mentioned Julian in that particular example. I'm sure there are other key individuals, key organisations. Any tips for the people watching about how you get them engaged, how you get that enthusiasm, how you get that initial conversation, and build from there?
I think reflecting on our own experiences, it is the dedicated time to be there, and that you don't work on your own time, you're working on the pace and time of the place and communities you're there to support. I think one thing I'm quite conscious of is a lot of what we've done, because of the results we've had, we've been able to accelerate at pace and scale. But I think it would be just start small. It can be a street or a neighbourhood. It doesn't have to be a big community. It doesn't have to be borough-wide. And I think there is a bit about learning from that experience at a really small scale, about spending time in a place, getting to know the people, the groups, the organisations, how people, and just observing how people move around, where they go, and that commitment of time in just one small place could eventually make the biggest difference to how you as a team and an organisation work in the future.
Thanks, Jodie. That's really helpful. I'm glad to say there is a question that's just popped in the chat. So I'm going to test my multitasking skills and try and read that out. So it's a question from Andrew. And it's to encourage senior leaders to have a serious look at doing this type of approach. In his own organisation, he's going to need evidence that it works or something to get them excited. Any suggestions on where to start with that?
It's absolutely the case that people are constantly looking for evidence to prove that this way of working works. My guess is when you mount the evidence, and there's an appallingly vast amount of evidence, that you'll discover it's not about evidence, it's about politics and power. That Leeds Beckett have just done a piece of research in the last few months around the work we've done in Leeds and the work that the Leeds City Council have done in neighbourhoods, definitively showing voluminous returns on social return on investment is something like 1 to 16 or something like that. Epidemiology, the study of well-being, shows very clearly that social networks are a critical feature of how people are well and recover quickly when they're unwell. So it seems to me that the evidence is pretty clear. We see it again. We did a 3-year study of this in Scotland, and the Scottish government funded the study, that what ends up happening is that you create a body of evidence that shows it's a really good idea to build the community ground up. But then you run into the political difficulties that evidence actually surfaced. And the predictable difficulties are that it's actually saying that to make this approach work, you've got to relocate power and you've got to relocate resource. And that's about agencies and about leaders giving up power and giving away power. That's not something you're going to create by just evidence alone, though it starts that way. And we can happily refer you to a body of evidence. But I think we also need to have the tough conversations. We need to do the organizational development work. We need to also convince our leaders, and I mean at all levels, our leaders, that there's a better story. So we're moving towards a preferred future, not marginal gains or making things a little bit better, but a preferred future. And I think moving towards that new public narrative, that's about movement making. So I think that there are a lot of leaders out there that want to change the social order and not just do a little bit of relief action. And I think the call is to those people to see that this is something that they can make a career out of, but more importantly, they can make a more just society around. There are people waiting for that call to action. And I think that, along with evidence, is what we need. We need the combination of the two.
Thank you, Cormac. Anything to add on that, Jodie, at all?
It's difficult to add to, but I think for us, to relate to our own experience, it depends who you're talking to and what, where you share your purpose with that particular leader. And I don't think it's potentially important that you have to convince every single senior leader you can think of at the same time. Again, it's starting small and finding who your allies are. And they might be in some unexpected places. So, don't try not to think of your senior leaders of the figureheads that you might see in your organisation week to week.
Thanks, Jodie. And there's a theme there of kind of starting small and building, whether it's a football club 150 years ago or in some of the streets and neighbourhoods of Doncaster, the way you've been working. I don't think there are any other questions in the chat. So there's one more just come in, which is from London Sport colleagues. And I know there was a session earlier, which I couldn't attend, around the impact of COVID-19 on activity levels and the response to that. But I just wonder, kind of relating that to the type of community engagement work you've been doing, what has the impact been of COVID-19 on some of the work, perhaps in Doncaster, perhaps some of the work you've been involved with, Cormac, and how do you currently view the kind of levels of energy, capacity in some of the communities that you're working with? Has it brought any additional challenges that weren't there before? So there's probably a few questions there, but generally, impact of COVID-19 on trying to do work of this nature with street-based community organisations and individuals.
Jodie, do you want to go first?
So there, since March 2020, there's been various phases of our work and response with communities. A lot of lessons were learned around our initial response. Our being as a council and not necessarily as a Get Doncaster Moving team. From experience in the recent months, it feels like the community is starting to look outward and how we can get started up again in terms of the fun stuff in communities. So we talk about physical activity and sport, especially. It feels like now the conversation is starting to be back around how we can set those opportunities up and start looking at supporting our environments to be accessible and welcoming again. We obviously saw through the pandemic many people using the parks, going for walks, using open spaces, but we do know that health inequalities have worsened, and the people that we're prioritising with our time prior to the pandemic need, are more likely to need wider support, not just around physical activity, but because of other pressures on them in their lives. So I think what we're seeing is that the pre-stream inquiry process that I described in the presentation, we weren't able to do through the lockdown experiences, and we've just started it again back in late July, early August. And we actually noticed a difference from the first few communities we had a go at this in. It was really hard to get people involved. People were still kind of nervous about contact, about changing their habits and then coming forward with that ideas. And it was a confidence thing. And we've just finished a phase in one of our communities last week, and the energy there feels 10 times more than it was when we started the process. So in just a few weeks, we're starting to see energy and enthusiasm for, I suppose, working how we were working back in March 2020, 18 months ago. And I'm waffling on a bit now, but it feels like in the last couple of months, we're starting to see new opportunities and new ideas from communities to get going again.
Thanks, Jodie. And Cormac, anything to add there? And any of the work
just to echo really what Jodie was saying. And I think it's been an incredible journey that's going to take us decades, personally, as well as societally, and our kids particularly. I think in positive and maybe not so positive ways, this experience will have marked our children, and they will grow up, with memories of this period of time. So that's also true with our communities all over the world. We the privilege of working in a lot of different countries, about 35 countries around the world. And just a couple of quick reflections on this. My mind goes back when I hear that question. My mind goes back to the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police officers, and his dying words, which were, "I can't breathe." And the reminder that we're talking about when we talk about COVID is a shift in a number of conversations, and hopefully really for the better and for the long term, around racial equity and inequity and structural racism in our institutions. And as George Floyd was calling out, "I can't breathe," we were also mindful that there were people, particularly people in certain socioeconomic groups who were more likely to get COVID than others, who were also contracting it, going back to March and April. And what were their, some of them, dying words, "I can't breathe." And then we have people who are living in abject poverty, many living in poverty, receiving programs where the money isn't going to them. It's going to outside agencies who can't breathe because they're having to make invidious choices between going to work and keeping themselves safe. So these are all really big issues, and linked to these issues are the wider issues of the fact that COVID and what we do to the Amazon rainforest are related. It's big issues. And they play out in our neighborhoods in a very, very local way. But also, I think what surfaced very strongly in our local communities was this recognition that actually you better get to know your neighbor before you need one, because they are first responders in a lot of instances, especially during lockdown. There was this recognition, in a sense, that certainly in the early stages, that COVID almost had a kind of a precipitating or a catalyzing effect around the importance of community. So back in March of 2020, in Italy, we were hearing people serenading each other from the balconies. We saw street bingo. So all kinds of innovation, people literally inventing ways. So as the institutions were furloughing, we were starting to see the sleeping giant of community awakening in a lot of ways and being really creative. And I just... sport was a big part of that. So we saw members of sporting clubs organizing and saying, let's connect with each other and let's keep each other safe, call each other on a daily basis until we get through this. And really just having human compassionate responses that helped people get through this, people who used to exercise together, organizing Zoom calls to exercise together, all kinds of inventiveness is my point. And I think it's really important that we figure out ways of not stifling that inventiveness. That I think during the hardest parts of this pandemic, we learned that we don't have to stand or fall by our bureaucratic compliance. People started to lighten up. Rules that don't make any sense were set aside. We trusted the community. We trusted local practitioners. We said, let's let the community tell us what they need. Big Lottery said, tell us what you require here. We'll make sure the funding gets to you. So I think there's a lot of learning that has come out of COVID, the mutual aid groups. And I hope we don't lose that. From Milwaukee to Jerusalem, where we saw community gardens all over Jerusalem flourish during COVID. My hope really is that we recognize that COVID wasn't all bad. It did precipitate some really, really important lessons about the power of community. And I just hope when COVID disappears that we don't replace it with the usual rules and bureaucracy, but we actually learn to be nimble and agile and take intelligent risks and continue to be courageous.
Thank you, Cormac. There are a couple more questions, but I think we are going to run out of time if we take those. So rather than going to those, and apologies to Chris and to Laura in the chat that we won't be able to respond to those within the next 4 minutes, I don't think, and do those questions justice. Instead, I'd just give Cormac or Jodie the opportunity, if they wanted to highlight any resources, if this may have piqued individuals' interest, if there are anything, or Jodie, I know you've already shared your kind of contact details. Just give the opportunity if there is anything. And Cormac, I'm mindful, I don't know if this is a good time to plug the second session that you're involved with tomorrow as part of the agenda. So feel free to. It was just to finish off. If there's anything else you wanted to say, or you feel colleagues on the call may find of interest, just in terms of wrap up. And any resources to point to, that would be really helpful, and then we'll just bring it to a close. So again, don't mind, Cormac, were you ready to come in and maybe mention the session tomorrow and anything else you'd like to, and then over to Jodie?
Yeah, I'm actually not there at the session tomorrow, so it's a recorded message. So the most important thing is that it's being facilitated by people who have a lot of lived and practical experience. And it's a great opportunity to get into the nuts and bolts of how to do this on Monday morning, which I think is really important. There's a lot of resources on our website, nurturedevelopment.com, which are practical, but I think there's a growing body of stories and a growing body of evidence now, both to show why it's worth doing, but also a little bit on how. So the final thing I'd say, and I think Jodie mentioned this earlier, is different people will apply these core principles in different ways, and I think that's as it should be. It's about finding out what works in your context. And I love what Jodie was saying about keep it small, keep it local, keep it led by local people, and keep, that listening at the heart of the practice. And we can't go too far wrong, really. So good luck tomorrow. I hope you enjoy the experience and that you take some practical, useful nuts and bolts and, tools and skills away with you. Jodie.
Thank you, Cormac. And Jodie, any closing remarks or pointers to further information from yourself? And just, by the way, I think it's at 11 o'clock tomorrow on the Active London conference for that kind of second session, which is called Flying at the Speed of Trust. Also links to community engagement kind of activities. So Jodie, any final thoughts before we bring it to close?
Just to direct, I shared the Well Doncaster and the Get Doncaster Moving website. We have got quite a lot of kind of impact reports and kind of just explaining how we've done things in a bit more detail than I've been able to do today. But the final bit would be just have a go. Our director of public health has a phrase, learn by doing, and for me that's the most you can do. So have a go at it.
Thanks, Jodie. A really positive way to finish off is have a go. I just wanted to close by saying thanks again to Cormac and Jodie for their time today and for their input today. Really, really valued that. For everybody watching, I hope you found that useful and helpful. I think we're just about getting to 4 p.m. and I think this is the last item on the Active London Conference for day one. So it's been a pretty nice day here, certainly in my corner of South East London. So I hope that if you've been at one or many sessions, you can get out, get active, and enjoy some time this evening reflecting perhaps on what you've heard. So thanks again, Cormac. Thanks, Jodie, and thank you, everybody.
Take care. Thanks, Warren.